The aftermath of Diane's humiliating run-in with the spike strip sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Word spread quickly. Some whispered in hushed tones about the protagonist's ingenious defense, while others outright cheered. Diane, however, was not one to admit defeat. She doubled down, calling an emergency HOA meeting and spinning a wild narrative about dangerous booby traps and reckless endangerment. But the protagonist was prepared. Armed with footage of Diane trespassing and clear evidence that the spike strip was legally installed with posted warnings, they turned the tables on her. The meeting, intended to be yet another power play for Diane and Thomas, instead became an open forum for decades of pent-up frustration. Neighbors, emboldened by the recent media coverage and their own shared grievances, stood up one by one to air their complaints. John and Linda exposed Thomas's backdoor dealings with contractors. Sarah detailed her fabricated fines and the HOA's threats against her home. Even long-silent homeowners, previously too afraid to speak, came forward with stories of intimidation, financial manipulation, and outright theft. Diane's grip on power was slipping, and she knew it. She kept glancing at Thomas, but for the first time, her husband had nothing to say. His smugness was gone, replaced by a growing look of concern. Then, the real bombshell dropped. The protagonist had spent weeks digging into the HOA's financials, consulting legal experts and forensic accountants. With the help of a neighbor who had once been a CPA, they uncovered something devastating: over $74,000 in missing funds. The money, collected from various special assessments over the years, had been siphoned into accounts linked to a shell company under Thomas Reynolds's name. A paper trail confirmed that a substantial portion of these funds had been funneled into a separate business, one owned by Thomas's brother, who conveniently held exclusive contracts with the HOA for maintenance, security, and landscaping. But the true motive behind the relentless campaign against the protagonist? A secret proposal to develop a new luxury housing complex that required access through the protagonist's property. Thomas had been negotiating with developers behind the scenes, promising them a direct route through the protagonist's land, one he had no legal right to offer. The aggressive push for the gate key, the harassment, the vandalism, it had all been a desperate attempt to pressure the protagonist into submission. Now, standing before an outraged crowd with the evidence laid bare, Thomas looked like a man drowning with no lifeline in sight. The fallout was immediate. A motion to remove the entire HOA board was put to a vote on the spot, and the results were overwhelming. Diane, Thomas, and their inner circle of cronies were ousted in disgrace. But the reckoning didn't stop there. Armed with concrete proof of embezzlement, the neighborhood pressed charges. Within days, law enforcement launched a formal investigation into Thomas's fraudulent dealings. As authorities combed through bank statements and records, more misdeeds surfaced: phony invoices, falsified budgets, and evidence that Thomas had even forged signatures to push through unauthorized assessments. When the arrest warrant came, it was almost anticlimactic. Thomas Reynolds, the man who had terrorized the community for years, was led away in handcuffs as cameras rolled. Diane, now utterly alone, refused to meet anyone's gaze. The HOA's reign of tyranny was over, but the cleanup was just beginning. With the corrupt board dismantled, the neighborhood faced a new challenge: rebuilding trust. The HOA, now under new leadership, implemented sweeping reforms to ensure transparency and prevent future abuses. Mandatory audits were introduced, fines and assessments were put to a community vote, and contracts were subjected to open bidding. As the dust settled, Diane quietly filed for divorce, distancing herself from the scandal that had consumed her life. One evening, she appeared at the protagonist's doorstep, an unfamiliar humility in her expression. She faltered, then sighed. "I didn't know how bad it had gotten." The protagonist studied her carefully, uncertain of how to respond. After everything, could an apology even matter? But Diane didn't try to justify her actions or shift blame. She simply handed over a small envelope, an official notice relinquishing all claims to the gate and property, then turned and walked away. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. The saga of Meadowview became more than just neighborhood gossip, it became a case study. Legal experts and advocacy groups latched onto the events, using them to push for legislative reform. The protagonist, once just another homeowner, found themselves at the center of a movement. A year later, new state laws were enacted to curb the unchecked power of HOAs, including what locals affectionately dubbed the Spike Law, named after the now legendary driveway defense that had set the chain of events into motion. The law specifically protected homeowners from predatory HOA overreach, ensuring that no board could arbitrarily seize property rights under the guise of community management. The protagonist, now something of a reluctant folk hero, was frequently contacted by homeowners across the country seeking advice on how to fight back against similar corruption. But for them, the victory wasn't in the publicity, it was in the quiet moments, sipping coffee on their porch, knowing that their home was truly theirs again. The battle had been exhausting, but it had been worth it. And so, life in Meadowview finally settled into something resembling peace. The protagonist's gate remained locked, their property intact, their neighborhood free from tyranny. On warm summer evenings, they would sometimes sit with Mr. Franklin, watching the sunset as he regaled them with old war stories and grumbled about crooked bureaucrats. The scars of the past lingered, but they were a reminder of a fight well fought. And if any future HOA board ever dared to step out of line again, they would know one thing for certain: the people of Meadowview were no longer afraid. The hum of suburban tranquility had always been a comforting sound to the protagonist, a quiet backdrop to weekend barbecues, morning coffee on the porch, and the occasional friendly nod from passing neighbors. But that peace shattered the moment Diane Morgan, the iron-fisted president of the Meadowview Homeowners Association, marched up the driveway with her ever-present clipboard and a practiced, saccharine smile that barely concealed her hunger for control. She tapped her manicured nails against the gate, her eyes flicking over the solid steel bars as if she owned them. "We'll need a copy of your gate key," she announced, her voice honeyed but firm. "For HOA access, easement rights, and all that." The protagonist frowned, knowing full well that their property had existed long before the HOA ever came into power, and no such clause existed in the bylaws. They'd done their homework when purchasing the house, ensuring that their lot sat just outside the HOA's direct jurisdiction. "That's not correct," they replied, crossing their arms. "There's no easement allowing HOA access to my gate." Diane's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes hardened. "Well," she said, tucking her clipboard closer to her chest, "that's not what we've decided." She turned on her heel and left, but the protagonist knew it wasn't over. A storm was coming. The first sign of retaliation came in the form of a neatly printed violation notice taped to the protagonist's front door the next morning. The supposed infraction: grass exceeding HOA height regulations. Except their lawn was trimmed, maintained, and within the acceptable length for city ordinances, let alone any HOA rule that shouldn't apply to them in the first place. Over the following week, the harassment escalated. More citations appeared, citing vague and baseless violations, unauthorized exterior paint color, despite no changes in years, improper trash placement, though the bins sat exactly where the city required them to be, and the most ridiculous of all, failure to maintain an HOA-approved mailbox. The protagonist might have laughed at the absurdity if not for the deeper implications. Then came the vandalism. It started small: garden lights mysteriously smashed, footprints in flower beds, a small chip in their mailbox that hadn't been there before. But things escalated quickly. One morning, they stepped outside to find deep gouges carved into their front lawn, as though someone had deliberately driven over it in the night. The security camera revealed shadowy figures, one tall, one shorter, stalking the property after midnight. It didn't take much to recognize Thomas Reynolds, Diane's husband, and his teenage son. Fed up, the protagonist reached out to a lawyer, laying out the full scope of the harassment and legal overreach. As expected, the attorney confirmed what they already knew: the HOA had no authority over their property. But the problem wasn't legality, it was enforcement. Fighting an HOA in court could be a drawn-out, expensive nightmare, something Diane and her cronies likely banked on. However, they weren't the only ones suffering. As the protagonist began speaking with neighbors, they uncovered a pattern of intimidation and shady dealings. John and Linda, the retirees down the street, had been fined repeatedly for unauthorized landscaping simply because they refused to hire the board's preferred contractor. Sarah, a single mother, had received a lien threat over an unpaid fine for a rule that didn't even exist in the HOA handbook. And then there was Mr. Franklin, the elderly war veteran who had nearly lost his home due to a mandatory assessment fee that had never been voted on. The deeper the protagonist dug, the clearer the picture became: this wasn't just about a gate. The HOA was a well-oiled machine of corruption, with Thomas Reynolds at the center of it all. Determined to expose the corruption, the protagonist took a bold step, bringing in the media. A local investigative journalist, intrigued by the growing list of complaints, agreed to cover the story. When the news crew arrived, they documented everything: the vandalism, the bogus fines, the security footage showing Thomas and his son lurking around the protagonist's property. The report aired that evening, sending shockwaves through the community. Suddenly, neighbors who had previously stayed silent out of fear began speaking up. More horror stories surfaced: inflated HOA fees with no accounting records, mysteriously disappearing funds, and lucrative contracts consistently awarded to companies owned by Thomas's relatives. The scandal exploded online, drawing attention from legal experts, watchdog groups, and even a few local politicians eager to crack down on HOA abuses. The tide was turning despite the growing backlash. Diane and Thomas remained defiant, until the protagonist decided to take matters into their own hands. With help from Mr. Franklin, they devised a legal yet highly effective deterrent. The retractable spike strip was installed discreetly at the entrance of their driveway, designed to activate only when someone ignored the clearly posted "No Trespassing" signs. It didn't take long for it to be put to the test. Late one evening, the protagonist heard the unmistakable sound of tires bursting, followed by an enraged shriek. Stepping outside, they found Diane Morgan standing beside her luxury SUV, its front tires completely shredded. "You absolute lunatic!" she screeched, pointing a trembling finger. The protagonists simply folded their arms. "You were trespassing," they said coolly. "And I have the signs to prove it." As Diane fumed, her once unshakable confidence crumbling, the protagonist knew they had finally tipped the scales in their favor. The battle wasn't over, but the HOA's reign of terror was nearing its end.